What are they doing?
There's lots to do. This is very fancy equipment.
Yes.
All right, I'll do that afterwards.
Color light comes in different colors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something just went off.
Or it was like voltage went up or something.
I want to read all the books on the wall, on the shelves.
On the what?
Every time I go into a library,
Yes.
I want to just read everything.
You can eat
That's lovely.
and swim. Yeah.
It certainly is.
But you know, it would be lovely to have more.
Don't look for me to.
I mean, that's why.
Door's closed and I can't talk. Okay.
That's why it was such a luxury to go to seminary.
Actually, will that phone
It
ring?
wasn't- Yes.
It might ring.
It hasn't.
Can
It
we
hasn't.
take it up? Well, can we just unplug it or something?
Let me tell I'll tell the desk and security that I'm gonna leave it off the hook.
Oh, you're reflected in the.
So the last thing is just don't look directly into the camera, and be comfortable and try not to say and if you do, I'll remind you.
Thank you.
Because everybody does it.
Yes.
It's totally fine. It's just and if you want to say something over again, you can. And
Take it from there.
okay, Clara. Okay.
Fred, it is wonderful to be with you today. Now, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
If I remember from your biography, that was a very important day for you. You were a pastor up in Oregon. Could you tell us about that time?
Yes, I was at St. David's Episcopal Church in the city of Portland. And we were having our regular 11 o'clock on Sunday morning service with a good congregation. Many of them were English people, English or Welsh. And they were worried about the situation because the Battle of Britain was on then, and the Marshal Goering was bombing the city into ruins, and I saw one Welshman with an amazingly long mustache. It went up like this and twirled and came down. And it was just blobbing like this, up and down. And he rushed up to me and he said, "We're at war." And he said the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. So as people came out, I thought at first he'd lost his marbles, because he had relatives in London, and was so distressed by the Battle of Britain. He was a man who used to bring his wife to church, then he went home and read the Sunday papers, and now he'd come back for his wife. And so I told people that, of course, about the hostilities, and many went back into church then to do some more praying. And that was the onset of the war for me. I immediately went the next morning and wrote letters to the Navy to see if they wouldn't take me as a chaplain. They didn't, because they were overwhelmed with requests at that time, and they had to investigate them all. But finally, through friends at Fort Mason, the general there asked that I be a chaplain, and it went right through just like a snap, like that. And on my way back to the Harvard School for Chaplains, and then I came to Fort Mason and opened up their new chapel on the grounds.
What was training for becoming a chaplain in the Second World War like? What did they teach you and ask you to think about?
Oh, they gave you a course in map reading, all kinds of health lectures, all kinds of sort of delineations of what the American soldier was like or ought to be, and vast amounts of what the British call square bashing. Exercises and marches and military deportment and right dressing, left dressing, reverse steps, and
So you learned all about marching.
we certainly did, overly much, which we never did after we put on after we got our assignments.
Mm-hmm. The church in Portland, if I recall, was one where you gave a stained glass window as a gift, and the Fort Mason Chapel where you came,
Yes.
you were also involved. You seem to have really been a stained glass fan.
Well, you know, it is so beautiful in churches. It brings a mood into the church, and I think it's very important. I've always treasured good glass. The Blenko people were making glass back in the 1930s, and at one time I ordered some glass from them. I never was able to use it, but I just was fascinated by what they were doing.
So you loved it, and it was something that fit in churches.
Yes.
What was the experience at Fort Mason like? You were brand new in the Army. You were brand new as a chaplain. The war was going on quite a ways from here, but the Presidio, I guess, was right in the middle of things.
The Presidio was the headquarters for the Western Division of the United States Army. Fort Mason was a separate affair. Fort Mason was the center from which all the troops going into the Pacific were processed. When I say all the troops, I mean those leaving Seattle, Los Angeles, San Diego. We were the higher headquarters for those sub-ports. And not only all the troops, but all the armament, all the sustaining needs, all the food, everything else was centered at Fort Mason. It was a huge enterprise.
And as these soldiers went through and transported through, they would, if they were there on Sunday, they would come and worship with you.
Yes, they did, yes.
You must have had a
Or
lot
they
of volume.
would drop in to ask the questions that people usually have for chaplains. Somebody at home was sick, or they had a relative who was flying out to say goodbye, before they got on a ship to go to this new experience of a loved one being in a military service overseas with uncertainties as to what was going to happen to them. Yes.
As you were in Fort Mason, and then all of a sudden, I understand you found yourself heading towards the battle lines in Europe. How did that happen, and what was that story like?
Well, I had a nice little interval, 2 little intervals. I felt that because all the chaplains on the troop transports regarded Fort Mason as their home, I ought to have the experience of what it was like to be a troop transport chaplain. So my general obligingly, I'm so grateful to him, Major General Fred Gilbreth, assigned me to be a transport chaplain on delivering one group of troops out into the South Pacific. And it took us weeks and weeks to get out there because we had to dodge Japanese submarines. And then on the second such journey that I made a couple of years after the first, we were on our way back when we got news of the D-Day landing. And when I got ashore, I found that orders were waiting for me to be shifted to Europe. I was very grateful for that. And so
Why did you want to go to Europe?
Because I had been in Germany when Hitler took over, and I saw the huge enthusiasm of the German people for him. And then later on, I began to meet refugees from Germany, and I saw what a really evil system they were developing there, and I felt that really the first thing we ought to be busy with was eliminating Adolf Hitler. So I was glad to be a part of the war effort and not so comfortably situated here in San Francisco, which was a pretty posh place to be during the early part of the war, I might add.
So you headed to Europe.
Yes.
If I remember the story, you told me one time that your orders did not say where you were going. It just said you were going, but there was no there. What was that all about?
Well, that's because the movements were so large at that time. When I got ready to sail from New York, I was with a group of 90 other chaplains, and we were all on the same ship, an Italian ship, which after the Italy backed out of the war, had steamed down into the protection of our Navy, and the whole crew, all of them Italians that had been pitched against us just a few months before, were now sailing us across to Britain. And when we got to Britain, I very quickly received orders to fly to France. And that was a matter of great secrecy, too, because they told me I was to go and join XXXX headquarters. But anybody in the know knew what XXX headquarters was. It was General Omar Nelson Bradley's headquarters, the man who fought the battle on the Western Front for the Allies. He was the head of 12th Army Group, which meant that he had 4 different armies that he had to manage in the battle against Hitler. It was the main opposition that the German forces had to face. And with great skill, he managed to meet them and defeat them, and is honored today as being one of the great generals of the Second World War.
Yeah.
Let me see, the guard is out here, our security.
Okay, okay.
I'll just
Stop, yeah.
find out.
Okay.
Okay.
How's it going?
It's going great. I don't know what's going on, and
You're running back and
They
forth
keep
here. It's
coming over
extremely
here.
distracting.
yeah. But no, Paul, stay where you are. I think she'll, I don't want you to change where you're sitting.
Yeah.
Remind me at the end, I want to do reaction shots for Paul, just,
I am doing it.
oh, they're,
I'm staying on one or the other for a little bit after this question is answered.
oh, okay. You're getting a nice, okay. It's going great. I think that they should just
He wanted in to turn the heat off.
Okay.
I told him just to forget it.
Yeah, yeah. It's really not good to break the flow for a lot of reasons.
Oh, we'll get the flow going. Ooh,
Burned
yeah.
her finger.
It's okay. It's just not our priority right now. Okay.
I thought at first Clara was killing a buzzing fly.
So you found yourself, Fred, in London. Were you there by yourself? Were there other chaplains there? You got this order with the XXX on it. What happened?
Oh, we were quartered near Birmingham.
We were, you and...
and all these other chaplains. And I had gone to church at Litchfield Cathedral on a Sunday morning, walking back with two chaplain friends, when I was met by a courier who asked my name and said I was wanted immediately. So I went and packed all my belongings, got a train and went into London, and stayed overnight in quarters with another officer, a major. And as the dawn came, I heard him say, "Here comes one now." And we both did a rather foolish thing. We heard this motorcycle flying in the sky, you know. It was a buzz bomb. So we ran to the window to see what would happen, which was not the best idea, really. But we saw the bomb fall and a great spout of smoke go up. And then I got up and had breakfast and went out to Biggin Airfield and flew to France, landing at Isigny, which is near that great town where the Queen Matilda's tapestry is located, telling about how the French invaded Britain in 1066. And we drove around that beautiful church where it's all kept in such a prized way, and went on to the little town of Perrières.
Now, the France at this point was occupied by the Allies, so this was safe territory.
This was really 2 months after D-Day, and we had pushed inland by then as far as Perrières, and we'd cut off the Corentin Peninsula, which had the port of Calais, and which would be so useful to us for bringing in shipments to sustain our army of oil and gasoline and food. Unfortunately, the Germans had so well fortified Calais that they held it to the very end of the war. And we used those artificial harbors, you know, that were built at the time of D-Day for bringing things in, and we had a road which we protected very carefully. This enabled General Bradley to use General Patton about the time I arrived to break through the German line and start his rapid movement across France.
That was happening when you arrived.
It happened when I arrived.
What was
yes.
your journey from Perrières to the General Bradley's camp, headquarters?
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, he wasn't there because, you see, a headquarters of the dimension of command that he held responsibility for was always divided up into forward, main, and rear. I was taken to rear. But then the next Sunday, I was flown on a little sort of mosquito plane to where his forward headquarters was and held a service at his center. And then
Did you meet him there?
not on that day. No, he was he was almost like the President of the United States. You don't just meet him.
Mm.
It's everything is programmed. And
When did you meet him?
I didn't really meet him until the end of the war, when I held a service of gratitude for the victory that we had won in Europe. When he came with all of his staff, his whole staff, and
This was at Victory?
it was a victory service, yes. More one of gratitude that the war had ended, and he.
Can you just say
he was
General Bradley?
General Bradley, yes. Then I met him several times after that.
What kind of a man did you find General Bradley?
Oh, he was a splendid person, almost beyond criticism. In fact, I don't know why I put that word "almost" in there. The criticism that he got was sometimes from the English, because there was a great sort of jealousy about who should be leading the war, Field Marshal Montgomery or Omar Nelson Bradley. Fortunately, I think it was in Bradley's hands. The great criticism that came to him was that if he had made movements other than he did on the part of our troops, we might have taken Berlin instead of letting the Russians take Berlin. But General Bradley cared a good deal about the lives of the troops who were under him, and he studied the situation and saw that it would have been very costly to American lives if we had pushed on and taken Berlin, and then when we'd gotten there, we'd only find a mass of ruins. So he wisely went the way he did.
As a chaplain there, right on the very edge of the battle in Europe during the Second World War, what was the pastoral work like? What did it involve, and who did you meet?
Well, you see, communications is so large a part of any battle in modern times. You only have to think of the war going on today in Afghanistan to know about that. It's so very important that a headquarters like Bradley had to have lines out for troops fighting from the Swiss border up to the Dutch border. And my colleague, a Roman Catholic chaplain, and I used to divide the work up so that 1 week one of us stayed at home at the main headquarters, and the other one went out to visit all these different units that were strung along the line. Some of them were armored battalions, some of them were telephone companies, some of them were radio groups, but they were everywhere. That gave each one of us the privilege of seeing what was happening in a very many different places along the line. Prized remembrances for me were being in Cologne on the first day we occupied the city, and finding the old cathedral there still standing. It had been subject to tremendous devastation all around it, and we thought how remarkable that our Air Force has managed to spare this important medieval building. But it had suffered so under the firestorms that had gone over the city that it was best described as a baked cathedral, but it was still standing. And I got some. Meanwhile, I had begun picking up shards of glass from churches that I saw that were devastated. I would walk around the exterior of the church, or maybe the interior, and pick them up, put them in an envelope, mark them as to place, and mail them home to my mother, who kept them all until the end of the war. By the end of the war, I had sent home envelopes covering about 25 different places, and that's how I got these shards of glass.
What inclined you to pick them up?
Well, because I thought that at the end of the war, I would have a church, and my fondness for stained glass, I thought maybe they'd be suitable for a window, made up of all these different fragments, with the figure of Christ at the center, signifying the symbol of resurrection, of hope and place and worship. That's why I did it. But I never had a church to do that. It was only when I came here to the Sequoias that suddenly they were unearthed.
Would you like to tell us the story of how that happened?
Well, we were all at dinner one night with Mrs. Susan Tom, whose husband had been a stained glass worker. And we were talking about his work, and I mentioned that I had these windows. Then we had present Mrs. Jean Wright, who was acquainted with the head of a stained glass studio in Emeryville.
Very near San Francisco.
Very near, called Reflection Studios. And she called because she'd been involved with having a window made to fit into the Century Club, which is the oldest women's club in this part of California. And she called up the head of the studio and told him about it, and he seemed to be quite excited. So later on we had a meeting of significant people, including Mr. Paul Chafee of the United Religious Trust.
Actually, it's from the Interfaith Center at the Presidio.
The Interfaith Center at the Presidio. And we began talking about it, and so the project began to get underway.
That's exciting. And
Yes.
we'll have to talk more about it. I'd like to take us back to Germany again, though.
Yes.
It must have been very dangerous traveling from those units along the line of fire, from one place to another place, visiting these towns. Didn't you ever worry about running into Germans?
Yes, I did. Fortunately, or I would have. I remember once near Malmedy, G3 used to send me out with a map that I ought to follow, you know. And as I was driving along, I began to hear artillery fire, and then I looked and saw an American unit who was stationed on a hillside overlooking a valley. On the other side of the valley